This week on Quality Digest Live, we'll chat with author Jacob Stoller about his new book, The Lean CEO.
Plus, the pitfalls of running faulty experiments and misinterpreting data. That and more when we come back. Welcome back to Quality Digest Live for May 8th, 2015. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest.
That you are, and I'm Quality Digest editor-in-chief, Dirk Ducharme. An opinion piece we ran this week brings up old arguments about broad standards versus industry-specific standards. I'm talking about ISO 9001, of course. Since its inception, there have been those who believe that the standard, ISO 9001, is too broad, not specific enough for their particular industry. And that is why you have ISO TS 16949 for the auto industry, which came out of QS 9000, which obviously was based on ISO 9001. You have AS 9100 for the aerospace industry, which is based on ISO 9001. You have TL 9000 for the telecommunications industry, which is also based on ISO 9001, and so forth. Each makes the argument that ISO 9001 by itself isn't enough, that it doesn't deliver quite everything that that particular industry needs. So this week we ran an article that kind of discussed this by Bud Waitman, and the article was Potential Risks of ISO DIS 9001 2015 to the Oil and Gas Industry, and he's referring to the upcoming ISO 9001 standard, which is due out later this year, ISO 9001 2015. It's important to note that Waitman is president of Qualified Specialists International, which specializes in the American Petroleum Institute's API, SPEC Q1 and Q2 conformity standards. API, SPEC Q1 and Q2 are quality management systems unique to the petroleum industry and are similar from our understanding to ISO 9001. In fact, the American Petroleum Institute website says that the current ISO 9001 standard conforms to about 85% of SPEC Q1, but not quite similar enough, argues Waitman, and therein lies the problem. In his words, quotes, the ISO Draft International Standard, ISO 9001 2015, has taken away prescriptive language for a documented quality manual and documented procedures, and has minimized several important requirements that were in ISO 9001 2008. His concern is that these changes will put pressure on suppliers, service companies, and the like within the oil and gas industry to, in a sense, perform their own checks in order to kind of backstop ISO 9001, in his opinion. So as an example, he writes that purchasers will be motivated to institute additional controls, such as reviews of the supplier's quality manuals and procedures, on-site audits of quality management systems, and on-site surveillance and final inspections, and so forth. And the reason for this having to do because the new ISO 9001 2015 standard eliminates the requirement, says Waitman, for a quality manual and eliminates the need for a management representative position. Furthermore, Waitman doesn't like that ISO DIS 9001 2015 does not focus specifically on risks associated with quality and delivery of the product. Because of all this, he advocates that those in the oil and gas industry stick with or pursue API SPEC 1 or SPEC 2. So, no big surprise, there was a quite lengthy and very well laid out, I should say, rebuttal to Waitman's viewpoint from one of our readers. You can read the whole thing yourself. It is quite lengthy. You can see it by visiting the article and then going down to the comments section. But I really wanted to point out one part of that rebuttal because I think it is at the crux of how ISO 9001 is used, or some people might say not used. Rebutting Waitman's comment about the lack of prescriptive language, our reader quotes the standard itself, which says this as a kind of an abstract. The organization shall maintain documented information to the extent necessary to support the operation of processes and retain documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. The organization's quality management system shall include documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. Our reader also notes that the standard acknowledges that the extent of documented information for a quality management system can actually differ from one organization to the other due to a lot of reasons, but here's a couple: the size of the organization and its type of activities, processes, and products and services, the complexity of the processes and their interactions, or even the competence of the persons who are running those processes. So in other words, if I can paraphrase our reader who rebutted Waitman, the effectiveness of ISO 9001 is all about how you implement it, but that the key requirements are there even for the oil and gas industry. And this really gets to the argument, I think, that has been going on for 30 years about broad standards. Because they are so broad, it may be difficult to understand if they adequately cover your industry's needs. And even if you do believe that they cover your industry, some people, including Waitman, and he kind of alludes to this, it may be possible for auditors to either overstep their bounds or, what Waitman is concerned with, overlook a key component in that company's QMS, maybe something related to safety. So kind of what Waitman is saying here in the gist of his article, matter of fact, he even comes out and he says, you know, for some industries, for a lot of industries, this broad standard, that's what he's calling the broad standard. Matter of fact, he calls it a trust-based standard in ISO 9001. He said, you know, that's fine, but you know, for the oil and gas industry, it really doesn't work for a variety of reasons. I actually tend to agree with the person who rebutted Waitman. I think it depends on how you choose to implement the standard, and to a certain extent, Waitman has a point, it depends on the auditors. It always comes down to the auditors. Auditors can always overstep their bounds and look at things they shouldn't be looking at because it's not within their scope to do that. Or if they don't know the industry real well, and I think that's a key point, if you have an auditor that isn't real familiar with the oil and gas industry, and comes in and is auditing the ISO 9001, is it possible that they may overlook something that they really should be looking at that's actually within their purview to look at, but they just don't see it that way, and they don't ask for a piece of documentation that may in fact relate to safety, which is Waitman's concerns, and in fact is something that, even interpreting the ISO 9001 standard, is a document they should look at. And it kind of tends down to the auditor. And I think that is what Waitman's concern is. He just thinks it's too broad and the auditors are going to miss stuff.
Yeah, and I think that you hit the nail on the head. It comes down to the auditor and how that auditor audits, and it also comes down to the language, the specificity of the language. And ISO 9001 does have some elements in it that are not as specific and that lead to more interpretation on the part of the auditor. Things like risk and what risk-based thinking means.
It depends.
It depends. It's a really interesting argument. This is a really good example.
And it's been around, this argument's been around for 30 years.
For a long time, since the beginning of ISO.
Yeah.
But this article is a really good look into how sector specifics deal with these issues. It's really important. So check that one out. Again, you can find that article down below on our player page there. Check it out by Bud Waitman. Yeah, Waitman, I believe.
Waitman?
Yeah, check the one out.
Sorry,
really good article. All right. Well, moving on. Now, yesterday in Quality Digest Daily, we ran a review of a new book published by McGraw-Hill Professional titled The Lean CEO, Leading the Way to World-Class Excellence. You can see it there. I have it. Look at that right here in my...
right here in your hand.
Wow, look at that. Wow, it's cool. Yes, this is the book right here. The Lean CEO is written by journalist, researcher, and consultant Jacob Stoller. I read the book, really good read. I recommend it very highly. The Lean CEO provides an excellent, and as I said, highly readable overview of the origins of lean and practical case studies from several leading companies here in the United States. So, to find out more about the book, we're very pleased now to welcome author Jacob Stoller to the show via Skype. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Mike.
How are you today?
I'm terrific, Mike. Great to be here.
Good. We're happy to have you here, Jacob. Well, as I said, I read your book, very impressed at the way you were able to squeeze a lot of a really relevant historical background on lean into your opening chapter. So the opening question is, was it hard to be concise when you're dealing with such a rich history of people and places and events that really built this overarching methodology that we now call lean?
Well, yes, it was hard, and it was painful, Mike. How did you know?
I sensed it.
I could sense your editor's eye here. Yes, it's, as you know, business readers tend to head for the exits pretty quickly, so we have to get to the point right away, and I certainly see that in your magazine. You're certainly very concise in a lot of your articles, so I'm sure you've been in the same place. But as a matter of fact, I cut tons of stuff that I would have liked to include, but I realized, here I am, I'm sort of the, like a local rock band, and there's the Rolling Stones waiting in the wings, in terms of the 28 CEOs. So what I did was actually, I took a sort of a lean approach in the end, when I was cutting things. I decided that I would only include things that the readers really needed to know to understand what the CEOs were saying in the case studies. So there were really two components to that. I mean, I think readers had to be able to understand the business problems with the sort of hierarchical management system that they had. And then they also had to understand how lean management was going to help.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I'm glad you touched on that. The 28 CEOs, very impressive group of CEOs. You could really understand their commitment. The case studies that are mentioned here that you bring up, they focus on organizations in a lot of different sectors. Of course, manufacturing is a key one, but healthcare, state government, and many others too. So, in your opinion, what are the commonalities that you discovered in these organizations at the beginnings of their lean journeys?
In a word, people. I think that if you look at the physical environments, of course, they're completely different. I mean, a hospital and a factory couldn't be more different. But if you look at the things that people do and the problems that you run into with groups of people working together, that's where you start to see a lot of commonality. For example, we know that in any kind of organization, you're going to see silos. You're going to see maybe people kind of beating around the bush and not solving problems. You're going to see managers who don't treat workers well and don't listen, et cetera, right? So those are very common problems. And, I think the beauty of lean and what it teaches us is that we can solve these problems in a very common way, regardless of the organization. I think there's a beautiful example in the book, and this is when Dr. John Toussaint was looking at outside of healthcare to find a better management system because of the problems they were having. And he went to visit Aaron's snowblowers, which is actually in nearby Wisconsin. And he has a beautiful description of how he saw these snowblowers on carts being processed, and he saw the care the workers were taking.
I think we may have lost Jacob there.
Did we lose Jacob?
Jacob? Well, we'll get Jacob.
We'll get him back here in just a second.
Yeah, but while we're waiting for that, I mean, where he was going with that is he was painting this picture of how lean is really a collaborative effort, not only within the organization but going outside the organization too. I mean, benchmarking isn't just a thing. With lean, I mean, you actually need to investigate what people are doing, whether they're in your industry or not. It's really interesting, and I think that in the case of healthcare, it was very much a paradigm shift. I think we have Jacob back now.
Yep.
Jacob, are you there?
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sorry about that.
We were just talking about the paradigm shift for healthcare. Where you were getting with, I think, here was this idea that it was a paradigm shift to say we're going to benchmark in manufacturing, get outside of healthcare and look at what manufacturers are doing to streamline their process.
Isn't that fascinating? I mean, you're looking at what people are doing, and there's so much commonality there that it's just incredible.
Jacob, the title of your book suggests that you talk about the role that top management must play in lean transformation, and one of the key pillars of lean management is a sense of humility and having respect for people. Top managers by nature, as we know, tend to be very self-confident and sometimes egotistical. Yeah. So how can leaders basically move beyond themselves in embracing lean?
That's very interesting. My view of humility and this sort of thing really changed through interviewing these 28 CEOs. And I think probably coming into this, I would have I would, and maybe a lot of people would agree with me, would have seen humility as a sort of a personality thing. Like you have a humble person who doesn't brag about their accomplishments and all that kind of thing. But what I found is a kind of humility in these CEOs, which was really, I guess I would call it an intellectual humility. In other words, understanding that they don't have all the answers, and a willingness to go into a situation and not only expect that they might be wrong, but be willing to really admit that openly. So I think there's that's to me is very, very essential kind of humility you have to have as a lean CEO, because really what you're doing is replacing this whole idea that you have a hierarchical structure where the managers know all the answer. So that's a part of it. I think also there's certain humility of purpose here. I mean, if you have a CEO who really wants to maybe make some great numbers for a year or two and then move on to something else, they're not going to be a lean CEO. I think lean CEO has to be somebody that actually believes in something larger than themselves, in terms of the company and the people that are involved.
Now, Jacob, we're getting very close to the end of the segment, but I want to ask you this question just before we let you go. And there's so many great case studies in this book. But is there any one of them that you would say really stood out and really best represented what the essence of a lean transformation is all about? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think there are many ways that there would be probably many ways to answer that question, depending on who the audience was. But I think for everybody, and this is people who maybe know nothing about lean, I really tend to tell the story about the Northwest Center. And this is really a wonderful story because it was an organization that started out really as, I guess, what you would call a charity for people with what we call disabilities. In other words, people who have cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, severe autism. And the organization was basically split up so that you had divisions that were making money, and then you had divisions that were providing work, and I'll call it make work for these people with disabilities. So what this new CEO did is he figured there's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be some way. We have all this innovation in business and all these smart people. Can't we find a way to make the company provide profitable work for all these people with these so-called disabilities? Well, what they did is, you would think maybe they bring in a bunch of psychologists and stuff, but that's not what they did. They brought in a veteran from the steel industry called Mike Quinn, 30 years of experience, and a lean guy. And they basically applied lean to the letter to this situation. Now, you'll have to read the book to read the story, but the end result is in a few years, they multiplied revenue by 500%. They turned all the divisions became profitable. And it's just a wonderful story. It's pure lean. And I think it's just a real sign of the power of managing people and the power of real, true respect for people.
Well, Jacob, I agree with you. I think that was a great case study, a very inspirational one. And this book is filled with them, by the way, folks. The Lean CEO, here it is right here. Make sure you check it out. I very highly recommend it. Jacob Stoller, thank you for joining us here today on Quality Digest Live, and we look forward to seeing you here in the pages or the digital pages of Quality Digest Daily coming up here in the future. Thanks again for joining us.
That's great, Mike. Thanks so much for having me.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Well, if you are a fan of Bill Levinson, we have another author who kind of writes in the same vein. We started a 3-part series this week by Matt Treglia called Pitfalls in Experimentation and Data Interpretation. And this is going to be proved to be a fun series because Treglia uses historical examples to illustrate how experimentation and data interpretation have either been misused or maybe not used at all in the past, and the disasters that has caused. And before we move on to our next segment, I just wanted to give you a touch of this. For instance, he talks about pitfall number 1, not running an experiment at all. And Treglia looks at, let's say, Ford's Edsel, which despite being the most engineered car to date at that time, it failed miserably. And why? Well, one reason, says Treglia, is that Ford did absolutely no test marketing prior to releasing the car. It's not that the company simply neglected to present the Edsel to focus groups or to feature it at the Detroit Auto Show, says Treglia. They literally kept the car hidden from consumers until the official release date. Ford intentionally avoided running an experiment, and as a result, it earned the top spot on the all-time list of greatest marketing blunders. Now, there's just something that had a financial impact.
Yeah,
More
big
interesting,
one, yeah.
Treglia also points out the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted from 1959 to 1961 and resulted in the death of somewhere between 15 million and 40 million people. One of the causes was the use of unproven agricultural techniques, such as deep plowing and close planting. A simple experiment would have shown the Chinese government at that time that these methods would not work. For instance, Treglia points out researchers could have tested the close planting technique by studying two fields side by side, both the same soil, same method of plowing, etc. The control field would have had normal seedling density, and the experimental field would have had increased seedling density. Within a couple of months, the researchers would have seen that the crops in the experimental field had stunted growth, and they would have concluded that close planting had a negative impact on plant growth. And he kind of goes on in this vein. I mean, bringing in types of misuses of data or not using data at all, and kind of some of the disasters it has caused, including the Challenger shuttle disaster in the past. And then also he follows it up, not just saying here's the problem, he follows up what we can learn from those disasters and misuse of data and how we should be addressing those or applying them today. So like I said, if you like Bill Levinson, go take a look at that article by Matt Treglia. You can just go to our page down there below our player page, click on the link, you'll see it. That is the first of 3 parts. The next part, I believe, is coming out next week, I believe. So
we'll look out for that. Really good stuff.
Good stuff, historicals. I love, and that's
Me
what
too.
Levinson does,
Yeah.
kind of these historical looks at how quality or data or whatnot are misused.
And perspective of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Derek. And thank you, Matt Treglia. Okay, well, let's talk now about what it means to be a really good change agent. Those that assume this role within their organizations, of course, must have a lot of discrete skills and attributes, some things like patience and determination, humility, confidence, and honesty. Another element that comes into play is an understanding of the basics of human psychology. And for that, our newest contributor, Kelly Graves, is uniquely positioned with some great insights and advice. Kelly is a consultant and change agent who uses his background in psychology to help organizations work through the communication issues that may be preventing them from achieving their highest levels of success. His latest article, actually the second part of the building blocks of organizational psychology, ran in Tuesday's issue of QDD. And in it, Kelly tackles how change agents can help turn concepts and plans into actions and behaviors. So to chat further about this topic, we're pleased now to welcome Kelly Graves to the show. Kelly, thanks again for joining us here in the studio. Good
Thank
seeing
you for having me back.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, for us having you, I guess.
Yes.
Well, all right, so the building blocks.
Okay.
Part 1, we talked about overcoming fear. So here in part 2, we talk about how you help people to overcome fear and then actually make changes and turn those changes, those planned changes, into action. So how do you overcome then the resistance to doing that? How do you help people actually turn plans into actions?
Well, it starts with involving them. And Jacob Stoller mentioned it, previous person that you had, mentioned it. And the real key is involving people. And they have the answers if we ask them, hey, we've got a problem here. Right. What are your ideas? These are my ideas. And so that's basically how I approach it.
Right. Well, but I mean, when you dig into that, like for instance, you had a really good case study in the piece about a mining supplier. They were making teeth for mining chains, I guess, and they had a problem with their quenching process. Right. It was a typical type of problem that needed to be figured out, but then they understood it, and then they needed to implement it among the workforce, and there were some bottlenecks with that. So how did that work out?
It's a real challenge. there was quite a few bottlenecks, and if we step back a little bit, the bottlenecks start because there isn't clear communication in the beginning. So you have a management employee structure where management says, we know all the answers, the employees are just supposed to work.
Right.
Okay. And that's the furthest from the truth. So what we had to do there is change the whole dynamic and say, okay, we have a problem that we think is in the quench area. Okay, we're having too much scrap, and it was an extensive amount of scrap. And so they just had to grab it by the horns and say, okay, what are your ideas, employees? These are our ideas. What is relevant? And the first problem that came up was very easy. We need to have a timer.
Yeah.
And I had talked to the employees about this, and they said, we've been asking for a timer for 6 months. And I'm going, let's order a damn timer. I mean, it's 80 or $100, and we're flushing thousands. So that was the first one. But then it was, we needed to look at the actual quench tank and the solution that was in there. Mm-hmm. The hard part in organizational change is taking the ideas and actually saying, we need to do something different, and creating that new behavior. And that's hard because people are used to the old behavior. So saying, what is that new behavior going to be? And then looking at it each day and making the adjustments, making the improvements. And that's the real key to any kind of change within an organization, is having a plan. What new behavior do we need to do? Adjust that. And then once you get that, then now let's create a habit so that becomes normal. But there's a challenge within that. So that's what you really have to work through as you're becoming really wanting to create change, I guess.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit. I mean, so let's talk about the timer, because that seems silly, and yet I think that happens a lot. Why? I mean, did management not know that they needed a timer? Did the employees not communicate to management? Was management so tight-fisted they didn't want to spend $50 to $80 for? I mean, how did it even get to that point where something so simple didn't get implemented?
It's amazing in organizations that the answers are pretty basic, but yet people aren't looking at them. They're not really respecting the employees. At first, let's step back just a little bit. Employees often go in and say, let's make this change, let's make that change, and they give it to their immediate supervisor. They say hi to the boss, hey, I've got these ideas, and they get turned down. And after about the fourth or fifth time,
they don't bother.
Yeah. They the organization, the leadership has taught them, we don't care what your thoughts are. Mm-hmm. And so, they'd ask for a timer for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, maybe a year. And that was me. It was brain dead. Just get them a stupid timer.
Yeah.
But they needed the stupid consultant to say, hey, we need a timer here. And sometimes that's an easy one. Sometimes it's a little bit tougher. Yeah. But it's management had taught the employees, shut up, we don't need to listen to you.
Okay. Well, and that's actually a really good point, because something that Dirk and I both noticed in your articles as we began to look at it, and before we even published it, was this idea that we wanted to flesh out this idea of truth and why you need truth from your employees, and how you help employees not fear retribution. I mean, sometimes employees will know something is fouled up in the process, and they're like, geez, this could cost me my job. I maybe shouldn't say anything about this. Right. So how do you overcome that?
That is, sometimes it's very easy. If the organization is open to change, it can be a 1 or 2 step process. If it's not, it can be a 6-month process. For instance, I was meeting with a client yesterday, and the management structure there is really ingrained. They're very structured. One person in particular does not want to change. So I was telling the CEO, it's going to take us 3 or 4 months just to get this one main manager just to be open to new ideas. And so it starts from having them listen to us, opening up a dialogue and saying, what if we were to do this? What if we were to ask the employees what their thoughts are? And so it's a very slow process. In other organizations, a client I worked with earlier in the week, it was very quick. We need to make some major changes to the organization. The industry is shrinking. We need to pull the trigger on a few things. In 2 weeks, we're having a strategic planning meeting, and we're going to restructure. And so in that organization, it's very quick. Boom, let's go. We're going to knock out a plan, and then we'll take that plan again, and how do we implement that into action and new behaviors. How do we change the organization? But with behaviors and habits.
So you're saying, if I'm understanding you properly, crisis actually leads to this easier than just a stable company. So, but I mean, really, if you're stable, you have to be looking at these things too. I mean, if you have a workforce that's not owning up to what's really going on, even if you're stable, you need to know that. You need to uncover those issues because you may quickly not be stable, right? So how do you do that? How do you, in good times or solid times, how do you ping for those things? How do you probe for that?
Let me answer that first with saying the 80-20 rule. 20% of the organizations out there are doing a good job, and they're being proactive, and they're constantly monitoring. And they're opening up the conversations with their employees and their management structure. And where there's a challenge with a manager who's poor, they do the professional development, they coach, they counsel, or they terminate. Okay, so they have their processes in place. And those are the GEs of the world, okay, and other great companies who are on it, they're pushing. The other 80% are, there's a lot of reasons for it, but usually they're behind the 8 ball. So when I come in, they're in firefighting mode. So even though they want to make changes, we don't have time. We're fighting a fire today, and we're just trying to stay ahead of the fire that's right nipping at us. And so typically what happens when I come in is that the fire has gotten so big, okay, we have to do something about that. And oddly enough, the way you have to change that is let's stop for a moment, let's really regroup, figure out what the real problem is instead of just shooting from the hip all the time. And again, we create a plan, and then we start moving it and we measure it, okay? But it has to come from the people, it has to come from the group, and I'm amazed that the answers are there. Every organization has the answers within them. They're just not pulling it out of the employees properly, and I think I mentioned that in our last segment. It's there, we just need to have the conversation.
Yeah, having the conversations is always important. That's what we all do, really. I mean, we all really want to have conversations with the people that are doing the work and
but sometimes people don't know how to have the conversation, or when they do, it comes out wrong. And that's where you need, one, the objective person, or you need to be able to pull yourself away to where the emotions aren't involved. You need to learn some new skills on how to introduce the conversation and put some of this stuff behind you that builds up between people who work with each other every day. And that's why sometimes it is important to have that objective person come in and say, okay, let's have this conversation, and I'm going to kind of facilitate, and because I hear what you're saying and what you're saying, and you guys are saying the same thing, but you're not hearing each other. You're still having the fight that you had 6 months ago. Okay.
It's funny that you have to bring in a consultant from the outside to tell people what they basically already know.
You know, they know, but interestingly enough, the CEO I was with yesterday, she said, I said, you really want to go through with this? It's going to be tough. And she goes, I know we need to, but it's scary. And I go, yeah, I know. I do the same thing with me, because I'll be making changes in my life, and I'll hit that wall. It happened 2 nights ago, and I thought, oh no, I need to take my own advice.
Yeah.
You know, and I have that choice. You can go left or you can go right. And I love going left, but it hasn't been working for me. Okay, let's go right.
Well, you know when it's scary and the energy's there, you know it's the right thing. When you have that risk involved that you know you have to do. Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, Kelly, you know, we're actually out of time. But you know, that was a quick 10 minutes. But you know, we want to have you back again. This has been a couple of great segments. I think Dirk would agree. And you know, we've done a couple of steps on the organizational building blocks. We'll continue to do that. We'll bring you back.
Thanks.
Kelly,
good.
thanks again. Good seeing you.
Here.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
and so we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show for today.
Yep.
So thank you all for joining us. Thanks for Jacob Stoller also for joining us and his book, The Lean CEO.
The Lean CEO right here.
Flash that at him.
Good book.
And,
yes, we like that.
And that's about it. We do have a webinar coming up, another webinar coming up in
a couple of weeks. On the 19th of May, next week, we'll have the webinar presenter for that on the show. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, come back and join us next week for QDL, and of course on Monday for QDD. Another great week for you coming up. So we'll see you then, and have a great weekend.
So long.
Bye.